the state of the Western Hemisphere. Despite its obvious importance to the security as well as the economy of our country, Latin America has generally been subjected to, at best, benign neglect by successive U.S. administrations, both Republican and Democrat. Our enemies have filled the vacuum. Notably, the Chinese Communist Party has made huge headways in colonizing the region, creating ports, electric grids, and other critical infrastructure. Some of these assets owned as well as operated by the Chinese. The Russians are providing, among other things, advanced arms, and Iran's regime and what remains of its foreign legion, Hezbollah, operate with impunity in key countries across Latin America. Unfortunately, much of the rest of the world is aflame, thanks to what I call World War Xi, a product of the strategic arson at the hands of the Chinese dictator Xi Jinping, and the ineptitude, or worse, the complicity of the outgoing Biden-Harris administration. So, the temptation to give short shrift to nations and challenges closer to home will likely arise again. But we cannot safely ignore, let alone acquiesce to, the subversion and the capture of our neighborhood by hostile foreign powers in a manner President James Monroe proscribed 200 years ago. Let me bring in Joseph Humire, one of our country's real preeminent experts on all of these topics. I'm sorry to say he's one of the relative few that I believe have both that kind of expertise and a very sensible attitude towards the challenges that we're facing, as well as the sorts of steps that we need to be taking to address those challenges in our front yard, if you will. Joseph, it's terrific to have you back, and thank you so much for giving us a full hour of your time. There's so much to talk about, and I'm ecstatic about being able to spend the time with you going through as much of it as we can. It's good to have you.
Absolutely, Frank. It's a pleasure to be on always.
Thank you. So, in the course of the election campaign just concluded, happily, we did hear a good bit about an outfit called Tren de Aragua, some outfit I'd never heard of before, frankly, until it burst on the scene in some, we were told, apartment buildings in Colorado. Tell us a little bit about this group, why we should care about it, and in a way, what it suggests about the real perils associated with not paying attention to what's going on in our hemisphere, let alone letting just anybody from those countries into ours.
No, absolutely. So this has been pretty much the latest phenomenon that's been happening for law enforcement to tackle the latest problem. Tren de Aragua is a Venezuelan mega gang that was born inside the prisons of Venezuela. It was then exported throughout the entire Western Hemisphere because of the Venezuelan migration, essentially the largest mass migration in the history of the Western Hemisphere, and the largest currently in the world is Venezuelans. There's about upwards of 8 million Venezuelans that have fled that country since 2014. And the Tren de Aragua specialize in how to basically infiltrate those migrant trails and use them for human smuggling, human trafficking operations.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
They had to get out of jail first.
Yeah.
Were they freed by their compadres? Or
There's been a lot of discussion about that, especially with the press. And, obviously President Trump made a lot of comments during the campaign about their releasing their criminals from the jails. And he was referring specifically to Venezuela, among some other countries, but mainly Venezuela. And President Trump was absolutely right. This is 100% empirically a fact. Many fact checkers, so-called fact checkers, actually tried to debunk it, but their debunking was based on we can't find any evidence, right? Well, of course, you're not going to find evidence in a totalitarian country that's not just going to publish it on websites. You have to actually know how to do research in those countries, as we have done in others, to be able to understand it. And I'll give you the bottom line, the facts. So the Venezuelan penitentiary services, which is controlled by a socialist regime, very much got in bed with these organized crime groups to allow the prisoners to take control of the prisons. Basically, the prisoners were the wardens of many of the prisons in Venezuela. because they couldn't handle it. They didn't have enough resources. They were overcrowded, so they just basically gave the prisons to the prisons to the prisoners. And through that, the prisoners.
This reminds me of the old line about the lunatics running the asylum. This sounds like it's pretty dangerous.
Yeah, no, very much. And I think they'll really understand the logic of that, because they gave a logic. Their logic was that it had to do with this idea of rehabilitation rather than punishment of criminals. But that doesn't make any sense. What it really had to do with is the nature of the Venezuelan regime embedded with organized crime. That's really what this is about. And so what happened?
Can I just ask you? I've actually had people say, Joseph, on the program that the Venezuelan government is actually just one giant cartel. I mean, it is a drug trafficking operation of the first order.
Yeah, and beyond drug trafficking.
Exaggeration?
No, it's not an exaggeration. It's beyond drug trafficking. It's all kinds of illicit operations, it's terrorist networks. The best way I describe it is as a platform. It's a platform for organized crime, for terrorism, for external actors, for hostile actors to the United States, for all the bad actors in the world to get together in the Western Hemisphere where they can be closer to the United States and engage in all kinds of asymmetric operations. So kind of shifting back to the Tren de Aragua.
Often with Venezuelan passports, no less.
Yeah, and that's part of it. I mean, their immigration services provide documentation to these individuals to legitimize their travel, their movement throughout the hemisphere. Going back to Tren de Aragua real quick, they took over these prisons, and what fundamentally happened was they got a lot of power and control because the Venezuelan government gave them concessions. In around 2019, the Ministry of Prisons of Venezuela began early release programs, early parole programs of these prisoners. Basically, people that were convicted of homicide, that had maybe a 20, 30-year sentence, were getting out in 3 to 4 years, right? And the accountability of these people that were getting out in these early parole programs, with no idea where these went. And this happened right at the time where the mass migration was pushing out of Venezuela. The second one is the main prison where the Tren de Aragua was born is this prison in the state of Aragua. That's why they're called the Tren de Aragua, in the city called Maracay. And it's called the Tocorón prison, right? That's the colloquial name for the prison. In September of last year, the Venezuelan regime shut down the prison. They raided the prison. They used over 12,000 soldiers, and they shut down the prison, and they so-called captured the leaders of the Tren de Aragua. That's at least what they said in their communications. But when they reported how many prisoners they transferred from that prison, they reported that they transferred 1,600 inmates. They said, we shut down this prison, we transferred 1,600 inmates. The problem is, according to very credible reporting by NGOs in Venezuela, there was over 3,000 inmates. They have no accountability of either the prisoners that were released for these early parole programs, nor to these prisoners that just went missing when they closed down the prison. So the fundamental logic would extend that these prisoners probably left the country and are probably in other countries throughout the Western Hemisphere. I travel a lot to Latin America, and when I speak to some of our partners in Central America, they told me firsthand that a lot of these prisoners, they believe, went to the United States. And so I'm giving you the data that suggests that what President Trump said, that they're sending their criminals, is 100% accurate. The media is making a huge mistake in trying to underestimate this problem because if the past is precedent, all you got to do is go to all the countries in South America that have been terrorized by this gang. You could talk to Chile, you could talk to Peru, you could talk to Colombia, among many others, and their authorities are going to tell you, do not underestimate this gang, because they will grow very rapidly. They have specific tactics that extend beyond other transnational criminal organizations, and the fact that they are state-sponsored by the Venezuelan regime gives them that added impetus to be able to grow much and expand much, much quicker.
But you're saying that they're actually sponsored by and made more dangerous as a result by a government. You call it an international socialist. I think it's a communist regime, is it not?
It's really a criminal regime more than anything. Their ideologies are, tied to socialism. They have communist elements from Cuba, but they have also Islamist elements. So they're just like a hybrid of different, failed ideologies combined with a criminal apparatus. And so, the state of Venezuela not only helps provide support to them. I believe they created them. And I'll be very quick and I'll describe that because of the origin of this. First of all, the origin of Tren de Aragua is very murky. Like no one really knows how they began inside that prison in Venezuela, in Maracay. There was other trains. So the way the criminal system in Venezuela is termed is inside the prison, they're called cars. And the movement of the criminal economy from inside the prison to surrounding neighborhoods is called trains. That's what. So there was other trains in Venezuela, Tren de Pacifico, Tren de Llanos. And this all started to rise to the surface during the period of Hugo Chavez. The Tren de Aragua wasn't born until about 2013 or 2014. And what I believe the Venezuelan government did is it used this train. They created this one to consolidate and capture all the other ones. Today, all those other trains rarely exist. And the only one that exists is Tren de Aragua. And they operate much the same way that Hezbollah operates for Iran, right? They're like a proxy element. They're a way to destabilize countries. They're a way to spy on their dissidents.
Foreign legion.
Yeah, exactly. Engage in illicit revenue schemes.
This could really represent a very serious national homeland security threat inside the United States. Donald Trump made it clear he was going to treat it as such. Do you think that that is now in prospect? And what would you recommend be done, knowing what you do about this outfit?
Yeah, so a couple of things, Frank. I actually have an op-ed that was ran the day before the election in Town Hall called Operation Aurora is absolutely necessary to tackle this gang, Tren de Aragua. And what Operation Aurora is something that President Trump said during his visit to Aurora, Colorado. And people often term that as a campaign stop. It actually wasn't. It wasn't a rally. It was a remarks that he made in the midst of his campaign to separate a little bit from the rallies that he was doing to talk about a policy issue at a very serious level. And what he described,
it was fact finding.
Yeah, it was basically fact finding. No. And what he said in Aurora, Colorado, he said he is going to launch this Operation Aurora at the federal level to essentially root out this gang from the streets and the neighborhoods of the United States as a first order of his new administration. Now that we know he's the president-elect of the United States, I absolutely believe that this is what he's going to do. And so the name...
And that it's absolutely essential that he do it.
No, I mean, so it's not only, very essential and everything, but it's also tied to other threats, right? So because it's tied to the Venezuelan regime, you're tied now to Hezbollah, you're tied now to Iran, you're tied to China. And then, we talked a lot throughout this year also about Chinese mafia fentanyl gangs that are moving into capturing territory or trying to buy farmland inside the United States. So all these threats start to converge and create conditions inside the United States that paralyzes us and doesn't enable us to react to the broader national security landscape throughout the world. And so that's why I think the border
which is the agenda, is it not?
No, that is.
And not an accident.
Absolutely, it's not an accident because that's why the border issue is so important, because you cannot deal with whether it's Ukraine or whether it's helping Israel, the Middle East. You can't do any of these issues with a porous border where basically threats are just infiltrating your country. So I think President Trump's absolutely right. That's going to be, I think, a top priority. And the interesting thing was he got the name because the center of gravity right now for the Tren de Aragua is in Texas. That's where they're really expanding very rapidly. They're in 4 cities in Texas at least. And San Antonio, which had a similar incident to what happened in Aurora, Colorado, the taking over of apartment complexes, they dubbed their operation in Texas by the Texas Department of Public Safety Operation Aurora, giving a resonance to what happened over there because that was the first time it was reported. So President Trump learned about that and said, we need to replicate this operation, but give it the federal government muscle to do it throughout the nationwide. And so I think that that's going to be a major development that we're going to hear about in the near future.
What does a project like Operation Aurora actually require? I mean, securing the border has got to be a condition precedent, doesn't it? But can law enforcement, can even ICE, federal authorities brought into bear, contend with this kind of cancer, do you think?
So that's a good point, Frank, because when President Trump mentions he's going to use a federal programs, I think he's talking about whole of government programs. I mean, this is not just going to fall on one agency. ICE obviously could be a lead agency, and they should be because they're in charge of deportations, but they're going to get support from multiple agencies, including the Department of Defense, I believe, which is under something that's called DoD support to civil authorities.
I asked you a question about what we need. You've said a whole of government response to effect this kind of Operation Aurora to take down. Well, I guess it must be said this cartel is a particularly dangerous one, but there are a bunch of others of them that are also now apparently operating with considerable impunity inside our country. Is that also going to be covered, do you think? And must it be?
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be exclusive to Tren de Aragua. I think Tren de Aragua is a specific target because of the rapid manner in which they're expanding, and they have specific characteristics of concern. But I think, going back to what
And just quickly, what would you say those are? Are they particularly vicious? Are they particularly successful in recruiting? What's the
no.
characteristics that you're most concerned about?
So what makes them different than MS-13 and the Mexican cartels and others that are very brutal and cause a lot of damage as well. It will obviously is the state sponsorship, but what that actually manifests into is a certain ideology that this transnational criminal organization has about taking over property. And so when you hear them taking over apartment complexes, taking over apartment buildings, using squatting tactics, it's because it goes to this ideology that they call invasions. They literally call it invasions. In Venezuela, they know about this. They call it invasiones. And so they invade property because they believe taking over territory is the key to creating power. And so that's a little bit different than the MS-13 and the Mexican cartels, who are much more profit oriented. These guys are profit oriented too, but they have that ideological component that, to me, in my mind, makes them more dangerous.
Do these other gangs not control territory effectively? Is that different from specific
They
property?
do, but they do it the kind of old-fashioned way, which is basically just flooding the zone with illicit crime and this, and then weakening the governance structure. These guys actually take a building, almost like an army would take a building, but they seize a building, but they don't do it with like high sophisticated weaponry. They do it through legal mechanisms, through lawfare, through denouncements on the police about human rights violations, or creating disinformation networks that they're being abused, victimization tactics of things that you see from authoritarian regimes. They apply that to the world of transnational organized crime, which is I think is why they're targeting sanctuary cities, because those are the sitting ducks for that kind of activity, because the laws in those cities don't allow the police to respond with an adequate level
They've
of.
been welcomed in. Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so Joseph, this is fascinating and extremely concerning, and I pray that you're right that Donald Trump will address these issues as first order of business. But let me back the lens up a little bit more. You touched on several aspects of why the Venezuelan government is so problematic. Give us a little bit more detail on, for example, you've made a close study of this, what the Iranians and their foreign, legion, Hezbollah, which I gather is, now coming apart at the seams in the Middle East, but it's got a considerable footprint here. Talk about that and how it relates specifically to the danger we face from Venezuela.
No, so yeah, Venezuela has become, as I mentioned before, kind of a platform. It basically invites all of the actors in the world that either want to be involved in illicit activities, or they want to attack the United States or hurt the United States. They have a safe space inside the country of Venezuela. Among the top of the list is Iran, and Iran has used Venezuela as a platform to be able to create military programs, to be able to insert terrorists, to be able to create disinformation networks, and basically an array of things to increase their ability to diminish the geographic disadvantage that they've had over time with the United States, understanding that Iran views the United States as the great Satan, right? The big obstacle for them to have regional hegemony. So
Are there
in that,
still these special flights that go back and forth between
yeah, I
Iran
mean
and
the flights
Venezuela regularly?
the flights to between Iran and Venezuela, between Caracas and Tehran, they're multiple flights, and they have multiple routes, and they don't just go to Iran. They often stop in places like Syria. They'll stop in places like Russia and Serbia. They even go to, most of the time they'll stop in Africa and Algeria, one of those countries, before they get down. So what used to be just one flight, but maybe like 10, 15 years ago, that everyone was looking at, they called Aero Terror, is now multiple flights and code shares and all kinds of things. So they have plenty of logistical connections.
Talk about metastasizing.
Yeah. So the thing I'm looking at, Frank, is, as we're looking at what's happening in the Middle East, and what's happening specifically with Israel, both in Gaza, but even beyond Gaza in the northern part with Hezbollah. And Israel's basically decided to take the fight, right? That your best defense is a good offense, and they basically made that very clear. They dismantled the leadership of both Hamas and Hezbollah in a matter of weeks, really, which is very impressive. But the thing that everyone, I think, like what I'm looking at, and I think everyone asks me, is, well, when are they going to activate the Latin American networks, right? Because we know they're there. And I think, obviously dismantling the leadership does impede that a little bit, because it's not clear where the communications are going to come from and how they're going to, because Hezbollah is permanently active in Latin America in doing illicit finance, basically running drugs, money laundering operations, contraband, to make money to be able to feed the war effort in the Middle East. But the time that
And
flipped,
some of those flights may have something to do with
the
moving
flights
drugs and so on, right?
and all these front companies and stuff. But all that can flip on a dime the minute that Iran or Hezbollah tells these people in Hezbollah in Latin America to say, now target terrorist attacks. Now let's start engaging. So since October 7th of last year, we've seen an uptick of these kind of like operations, at least starting to study the landscape to carry out either terrorist attacks, targeted assassinations, kidnapping plots, mostly against Israeli targets or Jewish targets inside the region. There's been at least three major arrests since October 7th of last year, one in Brazil, one in Colombia, one in one in Peru, that were tied to these type of operations. And something I want to put attention to: the Argentine government, who, as you know, under President Javier Milei, has been very bullish, both as an ally of Israel and the United States, but also against Iran and Hezbollah because they were attacked by them. A few weeks ago, they announced something that I thought was very relevant for what we're discussing. Is they revealed the identity of the leader of Hezbollah for Latin America, a person that many people did not know. And I can even say I've studied this very closely. I just learned about this guy a couple years ago. Like, this guy has been very clandestine, and nobody knew his name. His name, we all now know it, is Hussein Ahmad Karaki, and he was involved both in the 92 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, the 94 bombing of the Ame Culture Center, the takedown of the Panamanian plane in 94, a la Chiricanas, and he was involved in these plots, these recent plots, especially the one in Brazil, about doing target assassinations against Israeli citizens. So, yeah, he's in Lebanon. And so they were in the press conference that the Argentine government put out. They confirmed that he's in Lebanon. They confirmed that he's still alive, and they confirmed that he's still operational. So they issued an arrest order and a red notice for his capture. And to me, this was a big move by Argentina to put them on notice, to say, don't try to bring your shenanigans over here because we're going to punch back.
Well, if they were just shenanigans, it'd be one thing, but obviously it's murderous.
Yeah.
In the extreme. Let me ask you, Joseph, because I think that one of the key points here is that what's in Latin America doesn't necessarily stay in Latin America. We talked about, TDA as an example, but talk a little bit about Hezbollah and its ability, if they do go active in the terrorist mode, to either get people inside the United States who aren't here now for the purpose, or tap into existing cells of Hezbollah that are believed to be here in some number.
Yeah, so I think outside of these major criminal gangs and cartels and other things, I think the main terror element that is taken advantage of our porous border has been Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah has been moving up into and through our border for several years now. I know specific cases where what do we call Hezbollah facilitators? They may not be operational members of Hezbollah, but they're part of networks that help Hezbollah coming in through the border and landing in places like Dearborn, Michigan, and other places where they already have an established presence. So my sense is that Hezbollah has capitalized on the open border for the last several years to be able to pre-position itself inside the United States. I think what's holding everybody back was this election, because they wanted to see what was going to happen. If Kamala Harris had won this election, it's almost open season to start targeting Americans. But because she did not win the election and President Trump's in there, you have to adjust. They have to reassess. And Iran, to me, who's the kind of the mastermind behind a lot of this stuff, Iran's calculations on how to react, I think, depend on how they're going to be able to deal with President Trump. So my sense is in Israel and in the Middle East, their plan A, their top strategy, isn't to just use terrorism. Their top strategy is to use disinformation to delegitimize Israel in the international community. And I think that now they have to readjust, because more than likely the United States is now going to be the top diplomatic arm to support Israel around the world. So I think that that's going to change the equation. And I think that's the reason we haven't probably seen a lot of this stuff manifest itself into violence, but they're preparing to have that option if they choose to do so.
Yeah. Might they go for it during this sort of interregnum, when they know they've got a fairly weak administration vis-a-vis that, people letting them in and all the rest of it, and before Trump gets back in office?
There's certainly a vulnerability to transitions, as you know, Frank, very well. You've been involved in many of them. And there's always a bit of chaos and confusion. And there's also a kind of an opportunistic element to where you don't have necessarily a clear lanes of authority, right? Like, no one knows exactly who's calling the shots on what. So obviously, because of those conditions, you could say that, yes, there's a heightened sense of vulnerability for this. However, I would also think that Iran, to me, has a lot of, how to describe, I think they have a lot of apprehension because I think that they want to negotiate with President Trump, They know that
he thinks so too, which is an interesting question.
in Latin America, and we'll get into Peru in a second, they look at it as the other side of the Pacific, right? So the PRC has looked at this as having a whole Pacific strategy. Like what happens after they break the chain of island nations and they're able to get into the Blue Ocean? They need to actually have a source destination, and so they've been surveying the landscape in Latin America to look at ports that they can use to be able to, in the case that they have their military deployment, to be able to land into Latin America through with naval ships. So they tested this out throughout the several years. But they understand that if they came to Latin America immediately with an offer of military cooperation on ports, it probably wouldn't have sold very well. They would have had a lot of resistance because of the United States and other things like that. So they did it commercially. And as you know, Frank, that in China, everything commercial is tied to their military. It's just the way their laws are written and the way their government is structured. So they essentially created commercial agreements to either expand ports or build new ports. In the case of Peru, they built a new port in the city of Chancay that's basically going to become operational this year, in a matter of weeks, actually. And so they're going to become operational. And the thing about it is it's a mega port. It's the largest port on the Pacific Ocean. It's going to be able to carry, or I'm sorry, able to receive what they call triple E class cargo ships, which is the largest class of cargo ships. And obviously that's going to create volumes of dependency on Peru from China in terms of trade and commerce. But as the head of the Southcom, up until a change of command ceremony that's going to happen very soon, Laura Richardson, General, what she said is that that absolutely this port can be utilized by China for military purposes. This is the head of Southern Command saying this on the record before the United States Congress.
And Joseph, on that point, is it the case, as I understand it, that China actually owns the port? This is not sovereign Peruvian territory anymore, effectively.
So they're not the whole owner, but they are partial owners of the port. They have other concessions from other companies that have part of the ports. But what I've been hearing, and I don't have the details right now on me, but I've been hearing some discontent by some of the other partner companies that are involved in the port because China doesn't uphold to its commitments, and that's a consistent story in a lot of these things, right? Like even the inauguration of the port in November. My understanding, and this comes from sources in Peru, is that it actually isn't really ready to be able to be operational, but they're just going to announce that it's operational.
It's scheduled to be open.
It's scheduled to be open. It's going to have to be open. Xi Jinping is going to have to make a statement. So it's got to happen, even though there's still a lot of deficiencies with the port, is what I've been being told. And so what you're going to see, it's already been receiving cargo shipments for several months now, but I don't think it's going to be able to receive those big ones that you were talking about. Because it's got some issues.
Well, speaking of big ones, it's been sized, as I understand it, this megaport, to accommodate Chinese aircraft carriers and battle groups accompanying them. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah. So what I mentioned before, the triple E class cargo ship is about the same size as an aircraft carrier. So in terms of the capabilities of port loading, docking, deep water, all the characteristics that are needed to be able to have a big cargo ship anchor inside your port is the same characteristics you need for an aircraft carrier, with the only added dimension of the security, right? You're going to need the military. But in this case, Peru, and I think China simultaneously has been incrementally increasing its military engagement with Peru through invitations to defense academies and defense education, through the idea of hosting naval exercises, and the other side, like inviting Peruvian naval officers to participate in naval exercises. So they've been incrementally increasing their military engagement, because I think that fundamentally, I think we all know that this port's going to be at one time used to host the PLA's Navy. I think we all kind of understand that. The question is when, and now, since we have a new administration in the United States, what can the Trump administration do to stop that?
This location puts them essentially in a position to intercept or otherwise interfere with vital lines of communication, as the Navy calls them, between places like San Diego, for example, or other ports on the west coast of the United States, for that matter. And this is a power projection capability that we ignore at our extreme peril, I believe. We've really just skimmed the surface of so many of these challenges, but you've been very, very helpful, as always, in illuminating them. I did want to return to something we sort of talked about at the beginning, which is, given the sorts of things you've described, the presence in our hemisphere of mortal enemies of this country, and they're working together makes them even more dangerous. These gangs, these dictators of whatever stripe, the possibility that they're actively working with, cells in this country that wish to do us harm. Why is it we aren't paying more attention to this? And in your answer, if you would just, we haven't even gotten to Mexico or Brazil or Chile or other places that are also of considerable importance. Some now in the grips of very hostile regimes to this country as well. But there's got to be a better reason than that we just got a lot of other things going on. Or is there?
So, Frank, I think the big question that you're asking about why is the U.S. neglected Latin America, it's a combination of factors, but I think it's kind of an extension of a failed foreign policy thinking that's been happening in Washington for decades, really. And that failed foreign policy thinking has to do with kind of like democracy promotion and using basically the ability of the military to try to promote all these other things that are not intended to do other than chase bad guys. And it has this notion of essentially trying to think of Latin America as kind of like a region that's relatively peaceful and it's only trade and some cartels. And so that to me, I think that is an argument that a lot of our permanent diplomatic, military, and other class has been presenting about Latin America. So I think we have to assume part of the failure because a lot of people that have worked on Latin America for a long time, and I know these people because I've been in meetings and I've argued, and they've always presented this kind of perspective that the region's relatively tranquil. It's really calm relative to wars in the Middle East and everything that's going on in South Asia. Is that basically we don't have these interstate conflicts and we don't have these big terrorist networks. Here, Latin America is just some drugs, and then we have a lot of trade opportunities. And I thought that was a very mischaracterization of what was bubbling underneath, which was this autocratic network, this network tied to Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, tied to our hostile enemies. So I think it was basically a foreign policy failure. I think we missed it because our kind of our government really didn't think of it as serious as it should be. Like when I would present a lot about Iran and Latin America, as you know, that was one of my specialties. I would get resistance from people within the intelligence community and within the military community. But as I was getting resistance, maybe at the higher levels, I was getting people coming up to me at the mid levels to some of the lower levels and telling me, Joseph, we're working on this stuff and we're seeing exactly what you're saying. And that's how I built these strong relationships with our defense industry.
As I mentioned earlier, Joseph, in introducing you, I think the thing that has distinguished you, to my mind, is you're not only deeply knowledgeable about the region, but you do bring, well, common sense for one thing, but also a more, shall we say, robust mindset about our vital interests in the region and beyond. And I'm heartened to hear that at lower levels inside the government, there are people who are attuned to what you're focused on. But it is distressing that at senior levels, we've been deluding ourselves. And so say a few words about some of the nations that I mentioned a moment ago that we've just seen, I think, a full-on communist take power in Mexico. Lula is one. Chile, I'm a little unclear how bad that is, but I know there was one elected there a while ago. Is this sort of ideological evolution, much of it, I think, supported by Lula's, sort of his Sao Paulo forum, for example, as a vehicle for aiding and abetting the kind of march through these various countries of the Marxists. Just do we have the luxury, I guess is the bottom line, of persisting in this kind of focus elsewhere? That's really not a problem set.
Yeah, so I think if you look at Latin America today, first of all, it's worse than I've ever seen it, to be honest with you, and it's drastically different than when President Trump assumed office in 2017, 8 years ago. And what you're going to see is you're going to see three chunks of countries. You're going to see a chunk of countries that are fully autocratic, fully totalitarian, working with China, Russia, and Iran. And those are the countries you would expect: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and increasingly Bolivia. Then you see another chunk of countries that are, I would say, U.S. friendly, are open to do more with the United States. Some feel neglected because the United States doesn't really do as much as they should be. The Paraguays, the Uruguays, the Costa Ricas, unfortunately, some of the smaller countries. And then you would have Argentina, which is a unique case because it's historically Argentina is kind of a country that's most culturally distant from the United States, except you have probably the most pro-U.S. president in the history of Latin America as a president today, which is President Javier Milei. And then you have these middle tier countries, which I would say they're countries that have divisions in terms of they have leaders, many of them that are Marxists, that have sympathies with all these autocrats. But then you have institutions inside the country that are used to basically working with the United States and doing more engagement with democratic partners. And so those countries are in a tug of war. And I think the United States needs to help those countries basically win the democratic forces, win that tug of war. One of the prominent ones is Brazil. In Brazil, you have essentially this new kind of wave of lawfare and using essentially judicial measures to install kind of a dictatorship, right? So Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, is not as relevant right now as the Supreme Court and as the head of the Supreme Court, Alexandre Moraes, and other Supreme Court justices. So, but that doesn't mean that all of Brazil's institutions are captured. There's police institutions, there's military institutions, there's other institutions inside the country that the United States still has a good relationship with. So when President Trump's administration goes in the government, we have to work with them very closely.
There are people to work with, I guess, is a key takeaway. There are threats to them as well as to us that are emerging, and we need the focused attention of the Trump administration and our countrymen and women, for that matter. You bring that to light every day with your work at the Center for a Secure Free Society. Joseph Humire, I can't thank you enough for that work and for joining us from time to time. Come back soon if you would. Hope the rest of you will come back next time. Until then, go forth and multiply.